Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. I'm your host, Charles Max Wood, and I am here with Marc-André Cournoyer. It's been a minute since we've had you on the show or talked about any of the stuff you're working on. How are things going over there in are you in Toronto? I know you work for Shopify.
I'm in Montreal. I mean,
Montreal.
You got it right. I'm in Canada, but I'm in Montreal.
Right.
Yeah, I do go to Toronto sometimes, but from Montreal.
Yeah, my grandparents met in Montreal. So
really, yeah, it's a very nice city.
Yeah. Funny story. And they don't encourage this as much anymore, but my grandpa was a missionary for the LDS Church.
What? Really? Wow.
And my grandmother had joined the church in France and then immigrated to Argentina and then Uruguay and then to Montreal, and she was working in the French embassy there.
Really?
And,
so did your grandparents like this spoke French?
Yeah. Well, my grandmother did.
Okay.
My grandfather spoke a little bit of French. So,
okay. Do you speak French? A little bit of French?
Je parle un petit peu de français. Very, very little.
Okay. That's still good.
I studied French in high school. So I think in total I did like 6 years of French. And then I went and lived in Italy for 2 years. So
oh damn. Okay.
It's French is a mix in my head.
Yeah, maybe I guess I don't know like if it's I don't know if it helps with Italian. Did it? Yeah, it seems very far.
Did in the sense that a lot of the grammatical structures are similar.
Ah, yes. Okay.
And a lot of the ideas in learning the language were similar.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the root words were similar, but not
yeah.
all of them. And so they didn't have to teach me, you conjugate verbs and things like that. Because, I mean, in English, we just use the same word for all of the conjugations.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
So
that's the hard part for sure. Well, I mean, it's hard for everybody. I remember when I started, like the fact that because I joined like the startup community in Montreal, but everything happened. So I'm French Canadian, right? I speak French. I've been speaking French my whole life. I was raised in French, school in French too. And then when I wanted to start working in startups because they were using Rails and Ruby and all the cool stuff, I had to. So it was my first job speaking in English, and I was so stressed because of that. I would practice like the interview just because it was in English, right? I'm sure it was fuck it up. But it was not that hard, but the hardest part is the idioms, right? Or the expressions. Yep. Oh, man, that took me like 10 or 15 years, even today, right? Sometimes I have no idea what people are saying just because of those like contraction or expressions.
Yeah.
Probably
there's some of that going the other way, but I didn't find as much of it.
Yeah.
But anyway, and you're French Canadian. And I think my fourth or fifth great grandparents were French settlers in what is now Quebec. So
yeah, okay,
yeah, crazy stuff.
Damn,
but anyway,
French history in your family, cool.
Yeah, it's funny because and then we'll start talking about thin and technology. But
no, that's good too.
So I'm a Latter-day Saint, and we in the temple we do proxy ordinances like baptisms and stuff for people who have passed on. And so it was funny because we had kind of exhausted all the stuff on my mom's side, which is where my grandmother, who's French, all of her. And so my uncle started giving us names of ancestors and relatives from my dad's side. And my kids had gotten pretty accustomed to, having French names come up fairly regularly. And then for a while, it was my wife's family that we were doing work for. And so it was mostly English and like Scandinavian names. And then we started having French names come up again. My kids are like, oh, we're back on grandma's stuff. And I was like, well, actually, this is on my dad's side, not my mom's side, because they lived in Quebec and then they immigrated at least 6 or 7 generations ago. They moved to Connecticut and Vermont and then kind of worked their way west.
West. Okay, cool.
Yeah. So,
and where do you live now? Where is it?
I live in Utah.
Utah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So anyway, but it's fun. I love this stuff. So it's fun to kind of connect over it. But
it is interesting for sure. Yeah. I don't know that much the history of my family or more than that. I think we've been in Montreal region for a while for sure.
Right. Most of the stuff that I have now, granted, this is also run by the church, but familysearch.org is where I get a lot of the information on my family. You can also find it on like Ancestry and things like that. But effectively, if you're interested in it, what you do is you sign up for one of those systems. Family Search is free. And if you know back 2, 3, 4 generations, usually you just have to connect to your grandparents. And once you find your grandparents' records, then it opens everything else up. And Family Search has photos and stories and all kinds of stuff. So if anyone's interested, go to familysearch.org because that's where I pick up all this
That's
stuff.
a great ad right there. Yeah.
Well, it's free.
A sponsor.
So,
okay. Ah, no, okay.
yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, so yeah. So I think we initially invited you to talk about Thin, and you were saying that there was somewhat of an interesting story, but I guess before we get there, what is Thin?
Oh man, Thin. Well, Thin still exists today. The repo is still there. It's still a gem that I think is decreasing in popularity for good reasons. But it's a web server, exactly like in the same vein as Puma, Unicorn,
right.
Falcon, and all. It's a rack server.
Right.
So you can use it today, gem install Thin, but it's. I started the project 16 years ago, so it's quite old, and
wow.
I wouldn't say like I don't actively maintain it, right? So. And I haven't had any major issues in a while. Some people have helped me maintain it. Samuel Williams was a great help, I think a year ago or something, did lots of cleanup. I don't know if you know him. He created Falcon.
I just met him. I interviewed him for the Ruby Dev Summit.
Okay, he's really great. I mean, he's
so awesome.
Just the work that he's done with the fibers and fiber scheduler and Ruby Tree is amazing. And that's just a fraction of the stuff he's been doing. So a big fan of his work. But yeah, so Thin is that it's actually I think it was the first server that was a rack server at the time. When I created it, rack was just starting up about 16 years ago. The creator of rack, Christian, if I remember correctly, his name, created it, but he created some wrappers around the existing servers at a time, like Mongrel was the big one.
Yeah, Mongrel was.
Yeah, I forgot what the other ones were. Like WebRick, of course. It was WebRick. We still have today, but it was like the only options that you'd have. Or you would run on FastCGI. Yeah, or FastCGI. That was the way that you would run your Rails application at the time. And it would crash all the time. It would. That's what people told me. I was not I was very. I was young at the time, younger than I am today, but I was starting my career, so I was not running like a very high traffic website or a company at the time. So I
still remember though running WebRick or FastCGI and setting up a watcher that would keep track of how much memory my Rails app was using, so it could go and kill it before it ran out of memory.
That's the story. Yeah, everybody had those stories. Like it was like everybody. Some people say, "Oh, it's the thread. It's crashing, and the thread's like faulting," and like a bunch of those stories get around. So I think that's how I got the idea initially, because I heard some people say, "Well, I'm using Mongrel, but it keeps crashing, or FastCGI keeps crashing. I have to restart it." Like exactly like you said, people had cron jobs to kill it and to restart it because it crashed all the time. And I heard that Mongrel was crashing in the threading code, right? For some reason. And I look at the code of Mongrel, and if you go back like to 15, 16 years ago, Rails was not thread safe at all. So you could not it was not reentrant, right? So you needed a mutex around Rails. Before you call into Rails, that's how the web server did. There was a giant mutex.
I didn't know that.
Right? So even if you had like Mongrel, it was very equivalent Mongrel to Puma that we have today. So Puma I think is a lot better in the design, but also like the performance. But like in the concurrency aspect, was very, very equivalent. But the problem was that like at the time, I think that maybe threads were not as stable in Ruby, so they would crash. And then the thing that blew my mind is the threads are crashing, and we're not actually using the threads, right, for more space, because there's a giant block around Rails. So I thought that is stupid. We got to get rid of this. So my own idea was very stupid at the time. We say, I'm just going to create a server, no threads at all, right? Just get rid of the threads, no concurrency.
I'll just write my own web server. Yeah, no problem.
Yes, that's what I said. Like my idea was a pure Ruby server that has no thread, no concurrency at all, just sequence, right? Get one connection, send it to the framework, and then back. And that's it, right? Just the simplest thing that could possibly work. And I said, well, that's going to be more stable, right? I didn't really care about performance. And then that's where I discovered about Rack. And that's where I realized like that. I think I was onto something, not because of the performance, right? Just the nice way of their API felt so great. Like if you were rewind back to that time where playing with this fast CGI, the CGI API of Rails, that's how you would like if you were implementing a web server. Like there was no a common interface, so Rails had to add some code in it to run on fast CGI, some code to run on WebRig. This was all like bundled inside Rails. There was no API in the middle. And if you wanted to create your own framework, you had to redo this whole thing like from scratch, and it was awful. Like this API was awful, purely awful. But if you introduce Rack was super simple, right? Anybody, I think, can go. You look at it, you look at the Rack API, you can understand it. Like it's like 5 lines of code describe the whole API. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I remember when Rack came out.
Yeah.
So did Zed write Mongrel in something other than Ruby? Is it written in C or something?
Yeah, so Zed Shaw was the creator of Mongrel. It was very, very vocal and colorful, like a member of the Ruby community. Well, that was part of the fun too. Like at the time we had Why the Lucky Stiff, right? Zed Shaw, like lots of people, very colorful, and that's what got me into the community. Right, I really felt like I could. It felt more artful, I would say. I don't know if that's the right word, but like then scientific. Well, to me, it's much closer to how I think about projects, or at least projects that I do. Right, they're way more artful projects than like scientific projects. So yeah, Zed Shaw was a big member of that.
Yeah.
And he created Mongrel, and Mongrel, a large part of Mongrel was in Ruby. The part that was in C was, I think that was the big innovation of Mongrel, was that the parser was in C, was very strict. So it was kind of safe. It was the safest, one of the safest parser at the time. It was based on Raggle. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but Raggle is kind of it's a state machine generator. So you give it some rules, and then it's going to compile to whatever language. I don't know if at the time you could compile to Ruby, but you can today. But you would just like lay the rules, like it's like a Lexer, very similar to Lex, or but it creates a state machine in C, and then you can pass it a string, and it will call the callbacks depending on what's inside. So that allowed him to have a parser that was super strict. So it was very hard for somebody to craft like a request that was malicious because it was so strict.
Right.
So that was the reason why Mongrel was way more secure than the other parts, right? So that was also, I think, Zed Shaw's proudest part of the server, for good reason. But it was a brilliant combination of technology. I don't know that anybody before him had the idea to use Raggle for this type of work, but it was a brilliant. So I said, I'm going to pick this up. I'm going to pick up like the Raggle, the good part of Mongrel, which is like the parser, makes it super secure. I'm going to pick up like Rack, because Rack is the nice API. So combine the two. And the only thing that was missing is how do you do I/O, really, right? The networking part that I did not know. And at some point, I ended up on a library that was not very popular at the time. It is not popular no more at the time now. It's called Even Machine, but it used to be very, very popular in a Ruby world. It was kind of a precursor to Node.js. It's the same exact concurrency mechanism as Node.js, and I think it was an inspiration to Node.js too. But now it's not actively maintained anymore. But back in the days, like lots of for example, at GitHub, they were using Even Machine for lots of the stuff that they ran internally, because it was an asynchronous server. It was kind of a first async non-blocking I/O library to be used in Ruby. Was very stable. It was much more stable than Node.js at the time. So if you wanted to do a sync I/O, non-blocking I/O at the time, and you could not really use Node.js at the time, it was leaking memory everywhere. And Even Machine was a much better choice.
Yeah, Event Machine was, it
was the deal.
You see it in some really interesting places too.
And it was crazy fast. And I mean, I take no credit for the like. I think the reason that it didn't pick up is because people would run. The benchmark were crazy at the time compared to the other servers. It was much faster. I take no credit in that. This is all the credit to the people who created Even Machine. I just plug. I think that's mostly what I've done in my career. Lots of time, right? I think I don't think I'm good at like inventing those things, but I think I'm good at merging like existing technologies, right? Integrating them, which I did there. Like it's Even Machine, Rack, and the Mongrel parser that were like I thought those were like brilliant technologies. So why not merge them together? And that's what I did with that project.
Well, a lot of times people do things and yeah, everybody's like, they're so crazy innovative. And then if you really boil down what they did, yeah, it's this thing and this thing, and I put them together, and nobody had ever done that before.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody. So it's something I see often, right, with
Yeah.
the more junior engineers or people who are starting out.
Yeah.
Is like, man, I don't want to. This already exists, but usually I don't care. You should not care if it already exists.
Right.
Usually, if you just tweak or you focus on one specific feature or you combine it with another idea, you have something else. That's enough to make something that can become extremely popular or very useful to lots of people. And that's
Yeah.
what I realized pretty early on.
Yeah. In that particular case, a lot of times that's really what it boils down to is there are people that have this one particular problem and they're using this thing that solves like most of this part of the problem. And yeah, you you make this other really painful piece of the problem go away. And wow,
Yeah.
you innovated, but that's really what it boils down to. Again, you just solved a problem that
Yeah, I think there are multiple reasons to that. Like, but also, I mean, it's how software works, right? You
Mhm,
start with something extremely simple that works really well. The API is extremely clear. It's
mhm.
beautiful, right? It's a piece of art. And then somebody else comes in, oh, if only you could add this feature, and that would be useful to
Yeah,
me. But yeah, that feature. And that's how I think we start off with like very nice software that is simple and performant. And we end up with something that is not so good, right? So that's why
right.
I think we're always have opportunities, not only like in business, but also like in open source, right? If you want to do open source, but you're kind of worried that, oh, this has been done already, it's kind of
Mhm,
easy because if you're starting over with minimalism or simplicity in mind, you can always like find this. It's up to you to keep it simple, but that's how projects are good initially is because they start with just the strict minimum.
right.
That's the soul of the product, right? Or the
Mhm,
project. And then you just focus on that and remove all the crap. And that's
right.
how you end up, I think, with a much better project.
Yeah. Yeah, does this get us closer to, yeah, that focus, whether it's performance or, threading stability
Yeah.
or
I
right.
think all of the qualities that you mentioned are
Yeah,
all usually all boiled down to simplicity, right?
right.
It's kind of hard if you want something that is fast, simple, and a nice API or a beautiful. Like when I say beautiful, I mean the API is nice
Right.
to use and look at. I think those are all because like it's simple, right?
Yep.
The software is simple. There's no other way around it, for sure.
Yep. Absolutely. So getting back to kind of the story behind Thin, so you take Event Machine, you take I can't remember the other pieces you pulled in the
It's
parser from
the
Mongrel.
parser from Mongrel, which was built on Raggle. This was the only
Uh-huh.
part that was coded in C. But of course, like the internals of Alien Machine were all in C.
Right.
It's C++ actually. So I did not know anything about that. And
Right.
the other part was Rack. Yeah, just the
Right.
API, the Rack API. And but at the time, yeah, I think so. The main blocker with all this, with this architecture that I decided on, was that Rack was just started, right? So
Right.
it looks the API is simple, but that's on the server side. Now you have to make all the frameworks and all the like work with Rack. So I had to create the first ever like Rack
Oh.
and Handler for
Mhm.
Rails. Uh, and then once that was that worked, like, but it was not
Mhm.
like you can imagine, right? It's an adapter on
Right.
top of what the old fast CGI. So it took some time
Right.
until I think it was kind of it did not feel like a good API until Rails, sorry, officially switched to Rack, and that's where I
Yeah.
think like it became clear that this is the future. That's the way to do it, and especially people I think realize this not only because of the Rack API but the Rack middlewares, right? That's the
Right.
other key thing. Is you just learn about the Rack API, you say that's simple, but then you learn that it's the
Yeah, the
same
middleware is
exact paradigm that
powerful.
you use to introduce Rack middlewares, and
Mhm.
this to me like is one of the really big innovation that is an idea that is so simple, and now you see this middleware concept everywhere, right? As
Yeah.
it's a node, it's in Rust, there's a tower,
Mhm.
they're all using the same exact concept of wrapping the previous
Right.
app or endpoint, whatever middleware into the previous one, exactly
Mhm.
like Rack created at the time. That was 16 years ago, and we're still
Right.
using that idea today. So I think there was a brilliant API. That was
Yeah.
the core. I think this the one of the major reason that all of this became successful is because of Rack and the simplicity of it.
Yep. So, wa did Rails adopt Rack when MERB was merged in Rails
No, I
3,
think it
or
was
was it before that?
I don't know if
Maybe
I think
4?
I'm pretty sure it was before. Yeah, I think I'm
Okay.
pretty sure it was before. I don't remember who did it, but I remember, it was done as a push just because it was a nicer design, right? To say, well, we can refactor using middlewares afterwards, and each of the parts are more modular. So just with that in mind, it's end up with a much better design. You're right. Let's say that I think there was the big push why they did it initially was because, well, some apps want to run some API, like a Rails API stuff that we still have today. That was the main push behind it. If you don't need cookies, like if you're just serving it based on API, well, that's pretty easy to skip if you're implementing it as a Rack middleware. You just don't use it. You don't insert it in your middleware stack, and that's it. You don't need to do anything else. You don't need to have a bunch of ifs in your code. It's very simple. So I think that's why they refactored it initially. I'm pretty sure that was before MERB, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah, I don't remember for sure. I remember when it came in, and I remember pulling in some middleware and writing my own, and it was very handy.
And I would say, I think I'm pretty sure now, like rethinking about it, that MERB came afterwards, and I'm pretty sure too that MERB came to life because it was so simple now to create a framework, right?
Right.
So because of Rack,
it would run on standard stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And MERB initially was just Rack plus ERB. That's why it was called would run on Mongrel ERB, or maybe it was not Rack anyway. So it was returned to a much simpler like framework in case like that.
Right. So you get Rails to run on Rack. Then what? Now you're home free?
No.
I just not that simple.
Well, I don't. Oh yeah, I have a funny story. Like it's me. I don't know. It's gonna make me sound like very childish or whatever, but I don't care. So me and my friends, a funny story about Tin. When it started, before it became popular, or like in the first few versions, I would test it with some people who had like bigger websites than me. And we thought initially it was not called Thin, it was called Fart, because we thought that was to be so funny to run a fart cloud and run in cluster mode. And we would just chuckle all day about this. But then I came to realize, I don't think I want to be associated with a project that's called Fart, and the people keep. So I think just before pushing the button and making it to a public repo, I changed the name right there and then or something. I think it was a good decision in retrospect, but I still find it funny that that was the initial name, right, when we tested it internally in some very small website.
Oh, and I would have loved to fart some apps out there in the world.
Yeah, running a fart cloud. That was the only reason why it was called this. But it was kind of I think there's no way we're gonna get into the enterprise if that's what it's called, fart. So we changed the name.
Yeah.
And the app. So I initially at that time, I think I that's where I created I had a semi-popular website. It was called refactormycode.com, where you would post refactorings and stuff. And I think that's where I started. I'm pretty sure that's where I started testing my server, and it did okay. It was much more stable, and I would nail out the issues and stuff. But where it started picking up is like when people from the Ruby community at the time, they noticed the project and they started using it in some much bigger stuff. Like there are a few people at Engine Yard, which used to be really big at the time. I think it still exists today, but
I think they're still out there.
Yeah, there was some like the people there were awesome. They were really driving the Ruby open source community forward, and they just picked Thin and said, we're gonna run our customers on it. And like they helped figure out the issues. They would report bugs to me, help me figure it out. Tested. Like I was just blown away at the amount of work that it would do, and that people would really believe in the project, and that would drive me to work on it more and more and stuff and think about new and innovative features. And that's what I would do. I would work on weekends and nights, every night on this, because it was so much.
Nice.
And so I think that's how it picked up, right? Initially, lots of people at Engine Yard, lots of people everywhere, and eventually the people at Heroku, when they launched Heroku, I don't know how much of this is known today, but the initial version of Heroku, if you remember, it was just Ruby apps, right? Just Ruby apps. And you had no choice what server to use. It was using Thin for absolutely all the apps. So if you ran in the 5 or 3 first years of Heroku, if you ever used it for running your app, it would run on Thin, and that was a big driver, I think, to people using it. And then it became used, like I said, Engine Yard, VMware, and all the big companies started using it. But and that's how it picked up. It became a successful open source project, kind of because of the people at Engine Yard, I think, mostly.
Yeah, I remember when they had I can't remember if it was RailsConf or RubyConf. I want to say it was RubyConf in San Francisco. They did kind of a startup tour. And so you'd get on the bus and you'd go to Dropbox, which was using Rails, and then you'd go to Engine Yard, New Relic.
Oh, and, that's true. Yeah. Oh, what year was that? I didn't know that. Okay,
that was a long time ago. I think it was like 2008.
Okay. It's around the same time. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it was just an exciting time to be involved. I'm a little curious. So you go from, hey, I'm going to try and bolt this stuff together, to, hey, this stuff has to use Rack in order to be able to use Thin, to, okay, now we're getting adoption of both Rack and Thin. So how does that change the equation for you in maintaining Thin? Like, now it's not this mystery of how do I get this to work. Now it's
okay.
How do I maintain it from here?
Well, it has never been like a big burden. Like, I don't know. I don't relate at all to people saying like, to having bad experience with open source community. And I would just, if somebody like sent a PR that it did not agree with, I would just not merge it. And I don't know, like it felt really fluid at the time when people would just use it. And it was clear to me, like when there's a feature you had to use it, right? You had to implement it. For example, like writing the body to a temp file because it was too large in memory and stuff like that. Of course, I have to do it. I would usually like copy what other servers would do. That's what I would do, like start the implementation there. But yeah, it was not really a burden, right? There was no people like it. That was the thing that surprised me too. Maybe because like I made a big disclaimer to say, well, it still felt like beta software to me. And I said, all right, so if you want to use it in production, like you can do it, but I'm not responsible and stuff. But I mean, I've never had any bad experience or people like complaining or faulting me for issues that it would run on this. Sometimes there would be bugs and issues. I would fix them, but maybe that was why, right? Because I was so into the project that if there was an issue that was reported, I was so driven that I would fix it the next day. So who's going to complain if it's fixed the next day? So I think maybe that's where sometimes frustration come on with open source, right? Or you just people lose interest, and it's natural, right? I've lost interest in Thin, so I'm not working on it anymore.
Right.
So maybe that's where you start to see frustration, but there was none of this initially. It was like just wonder and like, this is cool. Like everybody was like very joyous about the project. So yeah, it's only good memories from that.
So I like that. I really like that, because I know different people have had different experience with open source. I mean, I've talked to some people where the project got big and it kind of took over their life. I know people who they poured their heart and soul into it, and then some bad actors in the community came in and complained about some things and just made it not worth it to them to continue. But it sounds like for you, it was just, you worked on it until you were done working on it.
Yeah, but I mean, it was important to me that I created. So my goal, one of my personal goal, like for doing this, or maybe I did not know really at the time. Well, I mean, my goal was really to do a server that was more stable, but eventually I really wanted at a time in my career to make something that was popular, because I wanted to create software that I felt was useful to lots of people, right? I wanted to create some useful work, really.
Right.
I really did, right? So that was driving me a lot. But after some point, right, I realized I don't need that many people to use my software to be happy. So I stopped caring at some point that people would truly use it, right? Or I think I was very fortunate to get this success very early on, right? To get lots and lots to get it very, very popular. And then I said, like, felt a bit like a checkbox to me. Said, okay, I did it. Now I don't care if you use it anymore.
Right.
If it's not for you, you just don't use it. And I think the other advantage too is because of Rack. If you want to switch to Puma, it takes one line. You just switch. It's going to take you 5 minutes to switch. So don't.
Yeah.
Right? So there's no lock. You're not locked into the server until you start using some of the built-in features. So maybe that played into it, right? So I think that's the other key advantage of like having nice APIs that you can swap to something else. People are not happy. Well, it takes 5 minutes literally to switch to something else,
Right.
and you can try it. So maybe that played into it too.
Yeah, it makes sense.
But it was about, like, for me, it was all about like pushing the boundaries of the server, like implementing like cool new features that were not had
Right.
not been done before. But at some point, that reached, like, I think I explored all that I could explore in a Ruby server, and I eventually got bored of it. Right, to say, I said, well, I think the project is done for me, and I fixed a little bit or merged, and other people started contributing other
Mhm.
features like along the lines of async programming and stuff like that. But for me, it was kind of done, and I moved to other stuff afterwards.
Right. So, yeah, I was gonna ask, so when you say that you're not maintaining thin anymore, was that like an active decision, or did you
No,
just
no.
kind of run out of things you wanted to do with it?
Yeah, exactly. I ran out of things, and it was nothing major happened, no major issue. So I mean, it's been very stable.
Mhm.
It's done software. It's done
Yeah.
software. So it's not, you can still use it. It still works, but it's done. So I'm not going to add to it. I'm not going to remove it too. So unless, I mean, if there's an issue, I find something else happens, maybe that changes in Ruby that makes it unsafe or something like that. Of
Right.
course, I'm gonna like yank the gem and stuff like that. But that has not happened.
That makes sense. So what are you working on now then?
Right now, well, right now I work on at Shopify. I work on Storefront, like, which is the website that we
Uh-huh.
give to people, and like, I worked a lot on the improvement. So so when I finished, in the other thing that I really fell into, that I drove a lot of my passion projects, were programming languages, compilers, and stuff like that. So
Oh,
ever
okay.
since that time, that maybe like 12 years ago, I've always been like, say, I wanted to focus and explore various types of projects for around compilers.
Mhm.
And when I joined Shopify about 3 years ago, I had this idea, which is probably like a bad tactic if you're interviewing for a company. But I was pitching my idea when I was interviewing at Shopify that I wanted to, I wanted to compile Liquid. So, Liquid is their
Uh-huh.
templating language. It's very popular. It was very popular
Yeah.
in Ruby because it was
It
the
came
first.
out of Jekyll? Is that where it
No, that's the
originated?
inverse. Yeah, Jekyll used Liquid. Yeah.
Oh, Jekyll. Yeah, it was Shopify that pioneered it.
Yeah, Shopify created Liquid, right?
Yeah.
It's because at the time, like, there was no template. You could not use ERB, right? This because we
Right.
we have the people, the merchants. If you're a user of Shopify, you have to write. You're writing yourself as a user of the platform. You're writing a template, so it has to be safe. So you
Right.
cannot, like, ERB is based on
You can't
eval.
let them insert Ruby because that's not safe.
Exactly. You call it's based on eval. So if you allow anybody to execute Ruby code, it's like the biggest security hole ever.
Yeah.
So so that was mandatory, that they came up with like a safe templating language. It was created by the founder, like Tobias Lüchte, who created like a Liquid at the time. But
Mhm.
I looked at it; it's open source. You can look at it right now. But when I looked at it, I said, "Well, that's a walking tree interpreter. That's not the best way to do it, right?" See, it just, if you know about those, it's like it just parses. There's always like in a compiler. There's usually two or more phases where first you parse the program into an AST. That's like a tree
Mhm.
representation, and then you can parse it to other formats. And then there's an interpreter or another compiler.
Right.
And like Liquid works with, you just parse it to an AST, and then you walk the AST down to execute
Mhm.
the program. Right. That's how actually Ruby 1.8 or 1.9 used, no,
Yeah.
1.8 I think used to work. It was a walking tree interpreter. We just parse the
Mhm.
AST and walk down to it.
Well,
So
sounds like a simple enough thing to write.
it is the most simplest thing. Yes, it's good. It's a very good starting
Yeah.
point. It's just that it's not the most efficient way to
Right.
do it. So if you think about any language that we have today, like anyone, like Java or PHP,
Mhm.
some of them, I'm not going to say all, but some of them like started this way, like Ruby, exactly. But eventually they evolve out of it because it's not efficient, right?
Right.
Having a tree structure, you can imagine, you jump in memory from there. It's all to consume lots of memory, but it's not
Mhm.
efficient to jump from like one
Right.
address to the other one. So the most efficient way, or the next step afterwards, is you compile to a custom bytecode where it's very linear in memory, right? So it's easy for the
Mhm.
compiler to know where to go next, and
Okay.
stuff like that. And it's much more compressed in memory. So less memory and faster. So it's kind of a no-brainer decision. But
Yeah.
then that means that you have to build an interpreter that interprets the bytecode.
Okay.
And it's called a virtual machine because you're kind of mimicking what the machine, the CPU on your machine is doing.
Right.
So my idea was to do exactly that for Liquid, which was not a very common thing, I think, I don't know of any other template language that do this, right? So normally, it's all language do that, programming language, but Liquid is not a programming language; it's a template language. But I still believe like that's the way to do it, is to compile like to an intermediate format bytecode. So I entered to Shopify with the goal of doing that, or with the idea, at least pitching the idea. And eventually we turned that into a real project, which is now being shipped live. And we're going to talk more about this as we go. But now all the templates, if you're rendering a website, is being compiled to an intermediate format and being evaluated.
Oh, nice.
So it's much more performant, but also that I think that leads to a better design too, because things are, it's a bit like Rack, right? We're going back to middlewares, is now you have like a pipeline of stuff that you compile. So it's easier to do other steps and do optimization, inspect the intermediate representation, right? Because you kind of have, you say, well, I'm going to execute on this other format that is much more optimized, but before that, you can do other steps to optimize it further. And that's why all language do it.
That's cool.
So that's one of the things I'm working on, and also exploring ways around it's possible. I'm working on a new server for Ruby, and also working with Rust around that. We were using Rust a lot at Shopify, and Rust in combination with Ruby. If you've never done that, it's really cool. It's getting easier and easier by the day. Yeah, you should, like, if people like listening to this, like, definitely give a look to Magnus, which is a Rust crate that makes it extremely easy to build, like not C extension, but native extension in Ruby. Like expose an API from Rust to Ruby. So it became very, now if I rewind back like 10 years or 15 years ago, if you wanted to build like a Ruby gem with native extension, that was like, it was very hard, right? The API was unclear. Yeah, the docs there was no official doc. You were kind of on your own, or how I did it is I looked at the code of Ruby itself to see how he did it, and tried to sometimes backtrack to say, oh, how could I do this outside of Ruby? It was so hard. But now, like, it seems like we're in a really good spot. If you look at Magnus, is extremely it's beautiful when you write something like in Rust and it compiles to a native extension in Ruby. So I think it's kind of, you get a best of both worlds, like from Rust and Ruby, where you get the safety of Rust and maybe the performance of it too. And then you get the nice API of Ruby on the other side.
Nice. I'll have to look at that. Maybe we'll do an episode on it.
Yeah, I think that's to me, if you ask me, like, what are the exciting stuff happening on Ruby these days? I think one key one, right, is the using Rust more, like on the side to build the native extensions is definitely one of them. And it may be in combination. I'm hoping that in combination with Ractors. I don't know if you've looked at the time to look at Ractors a little bit, what they are.
A little bit, not a lot.
And many threads too that came up. I think many threads was enabled in 3.3. With Ractors, I think they were introduced. I don't want to say anything wrong, but I think they were introduced in 3.0, I think. So if you never heard about those, like, it's a Ractor is kind of the first time in Ruby that you run something in a thread that is not bound. That usually, right, that's the kind of the asterisk is not bound by the JVL, the global VM lock. It's not always true, because things are there. There are some issues around that. There are some bugs, of course, but that's the idea, that you could run some really two threads in Ruby that are not bound by this lock. That is a problem that we're facing today with concurrency and parallelism in Ruby.
That's been an issue that we've been talking about for years and years and years.
For years and years, and that's the thing, right? Because I think the issue that we have is because lots of the code, especially native extension, like in Ruby gems, we've built those in mind that, it doesn't need to be thread safe, right? Because Ruby has the JVM lock. So lots of those gems with native extensions have been built with this idea that it does not need to be thread safe. So that I don't see how we could make that work, except if you build your native gems with Rust, because Rust ensures that when you compile the code, that your code is thread safe with if you know a little bit about Rust, like the send and sync markers that you get, the compiler will tell you as soon as you compile it if it's thread safe. So then you can build native extensions in Ruby that are guaranteed that compile time to be thread safe. So technically, they should be easy to be used across Ractors and stuff like that. So I don't think we're there yet, but I can see a very bright future for concurrency, right? Parallelism, concurrency, and all that stuff coming up to in Ruby with like Ractors and the many threads. Many threads is kind of this idea to go back to green threads, because now, like if you create a thread in Ruby, it's going to create a native thread, but it's still bound by the GVL. But with this idea of many thread that you can enable now with Ruby 3.3, is you could flip the switch, and all the threads that you create with thread new, it would be green threads, so they're not attached to a native thread. Right. And then the scheduler of Ruby takes care of doing the context switching, so it's much faster, and it's also cheaper to create threads. So technically, if we enable this, technically it should be as cheap to create a fiber as it is to create a thread.
Makes sense.
So, but this is just starting up, right? This is the stuff that's happening right now. So I don't know how ready it is for production stuff, but that's the stuff that excites me, and still that kind of re-sparked my excitement and stuff happening in Ruby, I would say.
Cool. So are you building the Liquid VM project in Rust then, or are you doing it in Ruby?
Yes.
Or
This is a big project that we have that is built in Rust. We have some other parts too, like in Shopify, like all around Shopify that are built. But I think that's one of the biggest projects that is built in Rust, and also using WebAssembly. So we're compiling Liquid to WebAssembly itself, and we have other parts. So if you know a little bit about Shopify, the platform, we have some extension points, like we call it Shopify functions. Right? You can it's like a bit like, think of it like a callback, right? There's a refund or something that you trigger a callback. Well, this callback, you can hook it, any merchant can hook into it. And the way you hook into it is you compile to WebAssembly and upload the function to Shopify. So this other part also is coded in Rust at Shopify. So we got those two areas that are very similar, like conceptually, right? Compiling Liquid and compiling functions that are built in Rust and WebAssembly. So very cool stuff that's happening. I think so. They're really, really cool technology that we use.
Wow. Well, I'll have to dive into that because, I've got some stuff that I'm working on, and some of it may be able to use some of that stuff to get some of those features, the thread safety and the speed and the efficiency, memory, all that good stuff. So.
Yeah. I think I would encourage everybody to try Ractors, because I think Ractors now, there was a call to, I think it was a Ruby Kaigi. I just saw it online. I was not there, right? But somebody at work sent me the link to the video. And then I think the problem they're running into is that nobody's using Ractors. Because nobody's using Ractors, they don't get better. And because they don't get, and nobody's using them because they're not getting better. So we're in this vicious cycle.
And then people complain that we don't have better concurrency functionality.
Exactly. Anymore. So we're at the point where we can make this happen, but it's kind of I don't know. I don't want to. I'm not going to be the one to drive the community forward to this, but that's something I think that needs to be driven forward to people. Maybe it could be just start a new server or try to use it for something else. It's not clear to me if Ractors are just for you. I think there are two approaches. Maybe you could run your full app into a Ractor. That could be your web app, or you could just use it like some sort of background job system or something You have just some parts where you say, because the problem with Ractors, right? You cannot pass any objects you want, right? You can only pass frozen objects that are Ractor safe. So if you pass a string, for example, you need to freeze it first. You cannot modify it afterwards. You can freeze it, pass it to Ractor, and then copy it and then modify it, but you cannot have the shared reference, right? You cannot do that, right? Because you have a shared pointer, shared memory reference, and then race conditions. So there are lots of it. So it's very hard, much harder. It's much closer to how languages like Rust force you to think about it. It's just that in Ruby, it's the first time that we have to think of this way. But I think if you're coming from Rust, you know about those paradigms of send and sync, and the compiler making your job really hard to forcing you to think about making your code thread safe. I think that's a really good step towards thinking in a world of where we could make Ractors work fully.
Cool. Well, maybe I'll go play with them.
Maybe, yeah. It does feel like me. I'm very excited about this because it does feel again, like I said, it comes back to when I started Thin 16 years ago, right? Where there are key technologies around, right? We had Rack, we had regular parser that we talked about, and we had even machine. And I do feel like we're seeing something again like this happening where right we have like there's Rust that allows to build thread safe native extension. We have Ractors coming up. We have the many threads coming to give us green threads. It's just that nobody's doing like the connective work, like the glue right between them, the key, and driving those stuff forward. Right. I mentioned Samuel Wins before. He did lots of work to push forward the usage of fibers. And that's mainly because of him now that we have the fiber scheduler and lots of cool stuff. So that is a cool thing. But I think something else needs to happen, like on the Ractor side. Because there's just one people working now in the Ruby core team on those two things. The same. I think it's. I don't want to say it wrong, but Koichi working on both Ractors and the many threads. Right, it's just one person working on all of this. So we do like at Shopify have a big team working on helping like driving Ruby forward. But I mean, we also need like other people with use cases to use those technology to drive forward.
Yep, makes sense.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we're in a very exciting time where I'm really hopeful for stuff to come. So yeah, and I'm hoping to drive forward with upcoming projects. But I'm hoping that people like watching this get excited about Ractors, like and building like native extension. All of this, I think, to me in my mind, it's pretty clear. It's all linked together. But if you don't see it, you should definitely try those technologies. I hope you get it, and that sparks some interest into like cool projects.
Yep, awesome. Now I know that you've written about some of this stuff on your blog. Like I think I saw an article on Rust and some of this other stuff. If people want to see what you're working on or connect with you, is there a good place for them to find you?
Well, I feel very old now. I'm just gonna say, write me an email. Yeah, I'm not very active online. You mentioned my blog. I don't think I've looked at it for 10 years or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to help anybody, or to just if you have questions about this stuff, or just write me an email. But yeah, it's ma.cournoyer at gmail.com. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to kind of roll us into picks and start wrapping us up. So yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in with my picks first. So I tend to pick board games as a pick every time. Lately, a game that my wife and I have been playing a whole bunch now at my house. It's Disney and Harry Potter. That's what we're into. That, kind of a fun thing. And there's a game called Death Eaters Rising, and effectively it's a dice game. You roll the dice, and then you try and match them up with cards to earn the cards, or fight the villains or whatever, right? And then eventually Voldemort comes out, and you have to fight him too. And anyway, it's pretty fun. Half the time I'm playing
family with your kids, yeah.
Yes. Oh, cool. And then about half the time I'm playing with the family, and the other half of the time it's just my wife and I. So
okay.
And let me look up on Board Game Geek so I can tell you all how hard it is to play. It's not terribly hard to play. Yeah, it's a board game weight of 2.37. And I tell people that kind of the casual game with a little bit of complexity is about a 2. So anyway, this is something that people can definitely pick up. Usually takes us about an hour, maybe a little longer to beat it. You can play 2 to 4 players. What I found is once you get to the 4th player, so you're starting wizards, so you pick a team. So it's Dumbledore's Army or Hogwarts, or what's the other one? Order of the Phoenix. And each of them have 2 starting cards. But the starting card abilities for one of each of those teams is if you have another wizard from that team, you get an extra die to roll. And then the other card is if you have a wizard from a specific one of the other teams, then you get an extra die to roll. But you get an extra die of the color or suit or whatever you want to call it team that you're on. And so it's a lot easier to get wizards that are on the same team as your team, and so, at least initially. And so once you get that 4th player in, then that 4th person is a little bit disadvantaged because they're playing with a wizard who gets their bonus off of another wizard that isn't as easy for them to acquire. So 3 is a little bit better than 4.
And it's like then role playing a little bit.
No, you just roll the dice. You choose. You move. Voldemort attacks a specific area, right? Does that thing there. And then you roll the dice and you can either acquire wizards or recruit wizards, or you can attack Death Eaters.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to have 5 Death Eaters before you can completely do all 5 damage to Voldemort. And you lose if you lose, because the wizards all take damage for different things. And so if you lose 8 wizards, you lose. If you lose one location entirely, you lose. Or if you lose 4 location cards, you also lose. So yeah, anyway, it's fun. It's just hard enough to be interesting, but it's not so hard that it's impossible to win. And I think we win more often than we lose. But anyway, it's a lot of fun. It's a cooperative game. So I'm going to pick that. I'll put links in the YouTube and Facebook comments to the game. And then, I'll also get an Amazon affiliate. If you click the Amazon link, it doesn't cost you anymore, but I do get a little bit of money for that. And then I'm going to just pick a couple of other things. So earlier this year, my wife and I went and saw a movie called The Shift. And anyway, it was awesome. It's basically the devil trying to win over this particular guy, but it's like sci-fi and stuff. So anyway, it was a really interesting twist. I don't want to give away the story, but anyway, awesome stuff. So definitely go see The Shift if you get a chance. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And then there was something else I was going to pick. I was going to shout out about the Ruby Dev Summit. So I've interviewed, I think by the time I'm done, I'm going to have interviewed 22 or 23 people. And I've got core team members from Ruby. I've got people who do Rails. I've got other podcasters. I've got people who work on like Ruby's infrastructure and ecosystem. So definitely go check it out. You can find it at rubydevsummit.com. You can enter your email address for free, and then I'll email you when the talks are coming out. If you want early access, you can sign up for a subscription on Top End Devs, and that'll give you early access, but you don't have to do that. So, that's up to you. Those talks will be coming out if you want to watch them during the window they're available, the second week in February. So anyway, that's all the stuff I've got. Mark, what picks do you have?
Picks. Well, I can pick like 3 of my favorite like Shopify merchants. There are 3 like the 2 that I consume like a lot. Like there's one for my coffee shop. It's they deliver coffee. It's a bit too local, but it's a Cafe Barista. It's in Montreal. If you're cafebarista.ca, if you're there, it's really good. They have equipment and machine. It's really amazing. And my second store, which is my where I spend a bit too much money. It's called Moog Audio. If you're into music or musical instrument, this is amazing. Like, it was just like there's an instrument that was released by Teenage Engineer a few weeks ago. I think it's called like KO2. It's like a sampler. If you're into those things, like it looks like a calculator. The design is beautiful. But it's a sampler. It's very thin, and the design of it, like it's amazing. It's just nice to look at, and I think it's the first time they release something that is not too expensive. Usually they release project that are thousands of dollars. This one I think is a lot cheaper. It's kind of their cheapest sampler. So if you want a sort of a gateway drug into that, look at it on moogvideo.com. And finally is where I drink lots of coffee, but I also drink lots of tea. And I order it from online from Firebelly Tea, which was started by it was co-founded by the president of Shopify.
Cool.
Harley, and it's a really good tea. And it's also founded by the other guy that started David's Tea in Canada. I don't know if it got to the US, but it was very popular in Canada and Quebec. And the tea is really good. So firebellytea.ca. Those are the three favorite Shopify merchants.
Nice. If you want to type those into the chat, then I will make sure that they end up in the, And then, beyond that, I am getting videos out now for Rails clips and Ruby bits. And so the Ruby bits, I'm starting to write a video game in Dragon Ruby, which is something that I've always wanted to do. So I'm excited about that. And my kids all think that's cool too. Dad's writing a video game. I'm trying to keep it simple, but I'm also trying to keep it kind of fun and funny. So anyway, we'll see how far we get on that and what challenges I run into. On the Rails clips, I am building out Rails Composer, railscomposer.com. And effectively, the idea is that I want Rails, which David has said he wants it to be a single developer framework, right? So single developer can make considerable progress on an app. So the plan is I want Rails to be a single developer experience, like DHH has said, but I want it to be a single developer experience if you're building SaaS. And so Rails Composer is going to be the pieces that you would compose to build a SaaS, right? So you build out, let's say you're building something for podcasters, you build the piece that's the for podcasters piece, and then you can pull in the rest of the pieces, which are user management, permissions management, and payment management, and your sales dashboard, and those kinds of things that you need to run your SaaS, but you shouldn't have to actually write, right? I want you to be able to put each piece in less than an hour. So your first day is essentially, I've got everything together except for what I'm selling, if that makes sense, right? And also marketing pieces. So I'm also looking at like SEO and a blog engine and things like that just plug into your layout neatly. So anyway, but I'm building I'm actually building out railscomposer.com first as a Ruby Clips series. So anyway, go check that out. And yeah, this was fun. It was good to catch up, Mark.
Hey, likewise. Thanks a lot for the invite.